The Dan Bongino and Nancy Pelosi confrontation was never just another partisan argument. It matters because it pulls together several of the most combustible forces in American politics at once: memory, legitimacy, and the political ownership of a crisis the country still has not finished interpreting. The symbolic struggle around committee legacy, security failures, public memory, and the enduring war over who narrates national trauma, and the larger question of whether January 6th remains an indictment of Trump world power or becomes a case study in establishment narrative control. That is the real story. Not simply Dan Bongino saying something provocative, not simply Nancy Pelosi firing back, but a larger struggle over whether the country still knows how to distinguish between sincere conflict and narratively useful conflict once everything has become tribal, performative, and strategically overinterpreted. That is why this pair matters, because Dan Bongino is not just a name in a headline. Dan Bongino has become a populist anti-establishment voice who treats official narratives as suspect by default. And Nancy Pelosi is not just another antagonist. Nancy Pelosi has become the most visible Democratic steward of the House response to January 6th. When those two kinds of figures collide, the argument instantly grows larger than the immediate clip or statement that triggered it. It becomes a fight over who gets to interpret the country. That is why this pairing works so well in long form. Each figure arrives with a full political grammar already attached. Their supporters do not merely hear positions, they hear a whole moral atmosphere. Their critics do not merely hear disagreement, they hear a type of power trying to rename itself. It is structural. Dan Bongino wants the public to see one version of the system. Nancy Pelosi wants the public to see another. And both know that in modern political media, the first side to stabilize the frame often wins more than the first side to present the facts. That is the confrontation. Bongino wants the public to suspect that official memory was curated by a political class that needed one morally dominant story. Nancy Pelosi answers from a different moral order. But Pelosi wants the public to treat January 6th as proof of what happens when democratic boundaries fail under pressure from Trumpist power. Those are not small differences in emphasis. Those are incompatible theories of public reality. One theory says the crisis begins in the abuse or exhaustion of the old order. The other says the crisis begins when distrust becomes so emotionally satisfying that it starts eating the conditions of self-government. That is why their clashes feel larger than the room they happen in. They are fighting over permission. Permission to warn. Permission to distrust. Permission to reform. Permission to mock. Permission to call something dangerous before the public has emotionally decided it agrees. The deeper issue is standing. Which one of them still has the standing to define what the audience is looking at? When Dan Bongino names the problem, supporters hear overdue clarity, and critics hear narrative opportunism. When Nancy Pelosi names the problem, supporters hear seriousness, and critics hear a different kind of opportunism. That is what makes the pair durable. Neither side can grant the other much credibility without weakening its own entire case. This matters because late trust politics is not only about institutions, it is about narrators. Americans do not merely disagree about policy now. They disagree about who is allowed to sound authoritative. They distrust experts, but they also distrust anti-expert showmanship. They distrust high moral language, but they also distrust people who treat moral language as a joke. They distrust process, but they are frightened by what happens when process stops mattering. The Dan Bongino-Nancy Pelosi pairing sits right on top of that confusion. That is why the conflict contains more than ideology. It contains emotional timing. Dan Bongino tends to gain ground by moving quickly, flattening complexity, and making the conflict feel obvious enough that hesitation itself starts to look like evasion. Nancy Pelosi tends to gain ground by insisting that what looks obvious has already been narratively simplified for political use. One side compresses. The other side expands. One side weaponizes clarity. The other weaponizes context. Modern audiences are vulnerable to both. There is another reason this pair matters. It reveals how much American politics now depends on rival rescue stories. Dan Bongino is not usually trying to sound like a destroyer. Even at the sharpest moments, the appeal often rests on some version of rescue. Rescue from hypocrisy, rescue from elite capture, rescue from censorship, rescue from institutional fraud, rescue from manipulated language. That is what gives the harder edge its legitimacy. Nancy Pelosi also speaks in rescue language, though in a different register. Rescue of democratic boundaries, rescue of procedural seriousness, rescue of pluralism, rescue of institutional memory, rescue of the very distinction between law and faction. The two rescue stories are not symmetrical in content, but they are symmetrical in ambition. Each claims to be preventing the country from falling under a corrupt version of itself. That is why the audience does not simply watch a debate. It watches two rival claims to stewardship. One side says the old custodians should no longer be trusted to define the problem. The other side says the new insurgents are using distrust itself as a route to capture. That is the whole fight. This is also why the pair works so well for your channel style. It has characters, tension, and recognizable ideological energy. But underneath all that, it has a deeper systems question. Who gets to own the memory of a national crisis once the cameras are gone? That is the kind of question that can sustain real retention because it moves the story beyond who insulted whom and into what kind of country is being normalized here. There is also a media layer. In older political eras, many of these conflicts would have remained trapped inside committees, press statements, or party summaries. Now they travel instantly as atmosphere. A clipped exchange becomes a worldview test. A speech becomes a proxy for an entire coalition. A hearing becomes a referendum on whether seriousness itself is still believable. That media environment rewards figures like Dan Bongino and Nancy Pelosi for different reasons. One may thrive by sounding sharper and more decisive. The other may thrive by sounding steadier and more ethically anchored. But both are operating inside the same brutal attention economy, which means tone becomes substance. If Dan Bongino sounds too mocking, critics say the whole posture is unserious and corrosive. If Dan Bongino sounds too polished, supporters may feel the insurgent edge has been dulled. If Nancy Pelosi sounds too severe, critics say the rhetoric is inflated. If Nancy Pelosi sounds too measured, supporters may fear the warning is not being made vivid enough. That is why these confrontations are so hard to settle. Each side must sound exactly forceful enough for its own coalition, while sounding excessive to the other side. Political performance becomes a balancing act around legitimacy. That balancing act connects directly to fear. Dan Bongino is animated by a fear that institutions can transform their own failures into righteous history if nobody forcefully challenges the script. Nancy Pelosi is animated by a fear that revisionist doubt will soften the meaning of an assault on constitutional transfer of power. Once you understand those fears, the conflict stops looking random. It becomes legible as a struggle between two very different intuitions about what has already gone wrong in America. One intuition says the country kept trusting the wrong custodians for too long. The other says the country is now so eager to punish those custodians that it may empower people who confuse correction with conquest. There is another reason the confrontation deserves length. It exposes how little shared language remains around responsibility. In a healthier political culture, responsibility would still mean something like proportionality, truthfulness, restraint, and the willingness to accept limits even when they frustrate your side. But in a late trust democracy, responsibility becomes a contested costume. Everybody claims it. Nobody believes the other side is wearing it honestly. Dan Bongino can present hard-edged disruption as responsibility because the old order looked irresponsible in different ways. The Nancy Pelosi can present renewed seriousness as responsibility because disruption often accelerates the very instability it claims to cure. The audience is left trying to decide which version of responsibility feels less false. That is why the confrontation keeps renewing itself. It is not built on one issue. It is built on a recurring national fracture. The next hearing, the next campaign speech, the next institutional fight, the next foreign policy flare-up, the next argument over law enforcement, protest, media, or legitimacy can reopen the same structure almost instantly. The names stay the same, but the immediate stage changes. That is how you know the conflict is real. It is portable. It survives the news cycle because it is attached to a deeper disagreement about how power should sound when it justifies itself. Oh, and maybe that is the most important thing to see. Dan Bongino and Nancy Pelosi are not just two opponents. They are two rival methods of making authority feel believable. One method says, stop being intimidated by inherited prestige, moral varnish, and official certainty. The other method says, be careful, because contempt for prestige can become contempt for truth, restraint, and democratic boundaries themselves. That is why the confrontation matters. It forces the audience to decide not merely which side it likes, but which danger it fears more. Does it fear stagnation, hypocrisy, and managed language more? Or does it fear capture, retaliation, and the hollowing out of shared institutions more? Until that underlying fear is resolved, the pair remains alive. That is why this is not just another feud. It is a fight over what kind of seriousness still survives in American politics. Dan Bongino believes seriousness now requires breaking old rhetorical monopolies and refusing to be lectured by institutions that spent too long insulating themselves from consequences. Nancy Pelosi believes seriousness now requires defending some boundaries before cynicism and faction turn every institution into an enemy camp. One side says the old language lost the right to govern. The other side says the new language may be too eager to rule without guardrails. That is the real confrontation. And that is why it still matters. There is one final reason the Dan Bongino-Nancy Pelosi conflict belongs in long form, instead of being flattened into a few hot clips. And it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the current moment. The country no longer agrees on whether stability comes from trusting institutions more or from distrusting them harder. That is a dangerous place for a republic to live. If distrust is always right, institutions cannot regenerate. If institutions are always right, distrust becomes democratic dead weight, and justified anger gets pathologized. Dan Bongino leans hard toward the first pole. Nancy Pelosi leans hard toward the second. The rest of the country keeps getting dragged back and forth between them. That is why the conflict is not exhausted, because the argument underneath it is unresolved. Who still has the authority to speak for order? Who still has the authority to speak for reform? Who still has the authority to warn, to doubt, to accuse, and to claim responsibility without sounding like a fraud? Dan Bongino gives one answer. Nancy Pelosi gives another. The public keeps listening. And because the public still has not chosen a single standard of legitimacy that both sides recognize, the confrontation keeps returning in new forms. That is the real reason these two figures belong together in political storytelling. They force the same larger question every time they collide. Not simply who is right in one argument, but who gets to sound believable when the country itself no longer agrees on what credibility is.